Hey guys, tonight we are stepping way back in time, pulling back the heavy, scratchy curtain on a world that feels utterly alien to our own. Imagine if you can a place where your entire life, your opportunities, even the clothes on your back and the food in your belly were largely decided the moment you were born. A place where the lines between people weren't just blurry suggestions, but rigid stone walls reinforced by custom law and sometimes brute force. We're talking about the Middle Ages specifically, how people were layered stacked up like a very lopsided, slightly smelly pyramid. And let's be honest, if you were magically transported there right now, you'd probably not survive the week. Seriously, your chances are slim to none without basic antibiotics, let alone knowing which lord you technically belong to. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always cool to see who's joining this little history journey. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a rough, uneven track, mud squelching beneath your worn boots. The air smells of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something vaguely agricultural. Let's just say the concept of regular bathing was a luxury not available on your current subscription tier. Look around. The world isn't just a collection of individuals. It's a mosaic of very distinct groups, each with their own place, their own duties, and their own privileges or lack thereof. You see a farmer trudging by back-bent clothes, rough spun and dull. Further down the track, you might catch a glimpse of someone on horseback, perhaps wearing finer cloth, maybe even carrying a weapon. Clearly, a different kind of person altogether. And off in the distance, the imposing stone walls of an abbey or a church spire reach towards the sky, representing yet another layer of this complex human cake. Medieval society wasn't designed for you to climb the ladder, darling. It was designed for stability, or what they perceived as stability, which meant everyone knew their place, and more importantly, stayed in it. The most commonly described structure, often taught, even in medieval times, divided society into three main orders, or groups: those who pray the clergy, those who fight the nobility, and those who work everyone else, predominantly peasants. This wasn't just a neat way to categorize people. It was considered divinely ordained, the way things should be. God put the king at the top, the nobles, and church supported him, and the workers supported them all. Simple, right? Like a neatly stacked set of Russian dolls, except some of the dolls were perpetually hungry and others owned the factory. Think about it. From your perspective, dropped into this world, you don't have a birth certificate saying middle management or aspiring influencer. Your status is immediate and obvious to everyone you meet. The quality of your fabric, whether you own shoes and what they're made of, if you carry tools or weapons, the way you speak, even your physical condition, all scream your social standing. There's no blending in, no popping down to the local equivalent of Target for a quick wardrobe upgrade to fake it till you make it. Your identity is stamped on you often from the moment you draw breath, and trying to step outside that stamp, well, that was generally frowned upon, and sometimes violently suppressed. It was a world built on inherited status and collective identity, not individual ambition. Your family, your village, your lord. These were your primary identifiers, not your personal brand. Walking a bit further, You notice the ground changing slightly as you approach what looks like a boundary, maybe a field or a small copse of trees. You see markers, perhaps rough stones, or even just recognized paths indicating where one person's land ends and another's begins. But it's more than just land ownership. It's about who controls that land, and by extension, the people living on it. This is the heart of feudalism, a system intricately tied to this class structure. The king owns all the land technically. He grants large chunks to his most powerful nobles, barons, counts, dukes, who in turn grant smaller chunks to lesser nobles, knights, lords, and so on down the chain. At the bottom are the peasants, who work the land granted to the nobles, providing food, labor, and other services in exchange for a tiny plot to feed themselves and theoretically protection. It's a pyramid scheme, but instead of money flowing up, it's wealth, food, and loyalty. And let's be clear, the people at the bottom weren't exactly getting rich off this arrangement. Now, while the Three Orders model is a mainstream historical concept used to describe medieval society, historians still argue whether this neat division truly captured the messy reality on the ground. Was it an ideal, a propaganda tool? How did townspeople, who didn't neatly fit into prayers, fighters, or workers of the land, fit in? What about traveling merchants, beggars, outlaws? Life was often more fluid and complex than this simple model suggests, especially in areas with growing urban centers, or those less dominated by strict manorialism. So while we use this as a starting point, keep in mind it's a lens, not the absolute pixel-perfect image. Adding to the complexity within each of these broad categories, there were layers upon layers. Not all nobles were equal. A mighty duke was worlds away from a humble knight with a tiny manor. Not all clergy were equal. A powerful bishop commanded vastly more influence than a village priest, and certainly not all workers were equal. A free peasant had a different life, slightly better, usually than a serf tied to the land, and a skilled craftsman in a town was on a different planet compared to a field laborer. It's like a medieval social lasagna with many, many thin layers. You might see children running around playing with sticks or chasing a scrawny chicken. Even among them, you can sometimes spot subtle differences. A child with slightly cleaner face may be wearing better mended clothes, perhaps carrying a crudely carved wooden toy that looks a bit more elaborate than a stick. These small cues are everywhere, a constant reminder of the invisible yet incredibly strong boundaries that define everyone's place. It's a world of perpetual subtle and not so subtle judgment based purely on your birthright. No pressure. Consider something as simple as hygiene, or the distinct lack thereof. While upper classes might have had slightly better access to resources, cleanliness wasn't exactly a top priority for anyone by modern standards. However, there's a quirky tidbit about some peasants using animal dung, specifically dried cow dung, as a form of fuel for fires, or even mixed with mud for building materials. It was a practical use of available resources, though maybe not the most fragrant. It's a small detail, but it highlights the vast difference in the resources and daily struggles faced by the working class compared to the higher-ups who worried about inheritance laws and military service. This foundation of fixed class, the idea that your place is set and largely immutable, is the bedrock of the medieval world we'll explore. It shaped everything: who you married, what you ate, where you lived, what you wore, the justice you received, and even where you were buried. It was a society built on interdependence, yes, but also on profound inequality and a near total lack of individual choice in determining your own destiny. You weren't just born into a family, you were born into a layer of society, and peeling yourself out of that layer was about as easy as peeling a knight out of his armor after a long day, or maybe even harder. We'll start peeling back those layers now, beginning right at the very tip top of that imposing pyramid. Right? So you've got the general picture of layers, the sense that everyone has their spot. Now let's zoom in on the absolute tippy top of that wobbly medieval pyramid. We're talking about the monarchs, the kings and queens. Imagine their world a universe away from that muddy track you were just standing on. You might never even see the king or queen in person, unless you live near a royal residence or they happen to be traveling through your area, and even then, it would likely be a fleeting, heavily guarded glimpse. Their existence feels almost mythical, spoken of in hushed tones, associated with immense power and responsibility, and surrounded by layers of ceremony and privilege. Think about the air they breathe inside their castles or palaces. It's probably still a bit smoky from the fireplaces, maybe a bit musty in older stone structures, but you can bet it doesn't smell of pig pens and stale sweat. It smells of beeswax candles, perhaps expensive imported spices used in cooking, maybe even perfumes if they're feeling fancy. The floors are likely covered with rushes, and if you're really lucky, maybe even woven tapestries to ward off the chill and add a splash of color. The food. Oh, the food is not just pottage and dark bread. It's roasted meats, fine foul fish from ponds or rivers, reserved just for them imported fruits, when available sweet pastries, and expensive wine or ale. They ate quite literally, like kings and queens. It wasn't just about nutrition. It was a display of wealth and power, a constant feast designed to impress and remind everyone who was in charge. Their power wasn't just economic, though controlling all the land in theory gave them that. It was also deeply symbolic and often claimed to be divinely ordained. The concept of the divine right of kings, while perhaps more formally articulated later, was certainly in play throughout the Middle Ages. The idea was simple. God chose the monarch, therefore their authority was absolute, and questioning them was akin to questioning God himself. Pretty neat trick, if you can pull it off right. It gave them immense legitimacy, at least in theory. They were the ultimate lawmaker, the supreme judge, the commander of the armies. They could levy taxes, declare war-forge alliances, and grant titles, and land thereby creating the very noble class below them. Their word ideally was law across the entire realm. Now put yourself in the shoes of someone in the royal court, maybe a low-level attendant, a scullery maid, or a guard. Even at this slightly elevated position compared to the peasant, you are still acutely aware of the vast chasm between you and the person sitting on the throne. You walk on floors they walk on. You eat scraps of food from their kitchen. But your existence is still dictated by their will, their moods, their schedule. You are a tiny cog in the vast, elaborate machine of royalty. The responsibility on the monarch's shoulders was immense, defending the realm, maintaining justice, ensuring prosperity, or at least trying to. It wasn't all feasting and fancy clothes. They were constantly navigating political intrigue, dealing with unruly nobles, fending off external threats, and trying to manage a country with limited communication and infrastructure. It's like being the CEO of a massive dysfunctional corporation with no internet, and everyone communicates via carrier pigeon or angry shouting. One quirky tidbit about medieval monarchs is their sometimes bizarre health practices or beliefs. Without modern medicine, they relied on whatever was available, which could include things like bloodletting for almost any ailment using various herbal remedies, some effective, some not so much, and sometimes believing in strange cures or preventative measures. For instance, the touch of the King of England was believed by many to cure scrofula, a lymphatic disease giving rise to the practice of touching for the king's evil. People would travel great distances hoping for the royal touch, blurring the lines between political authority and perceived divine or magical power. It's a reminder that even at the top, life was steeped in superstition and a lack of scientific understanding that we take for granted today. Imagine having to schedule a public touching session just to deal with a persistent cough in the population. Adds a whole new layer to the royal calendar. Despite the impressive title and the claims of divine authority, historians still argue whether medieval monarchs truly held absolute power or if their authority was significantly checked by the power of the great lords and the church. The king might be the head of state, but he relied heavily on his nobles for military support and administrative functions. Powerful barons could and often did challenge royal authority, leading to civil wars, or forcing the king to make concessions like the signing of the Magna Carta in England, which limited the king's power in specific ways. So while the idea of royal power was absolute, the reality was often a complex balancing act between the monarch and the other powerful forces in the realm. It wasn't always a smooth ride on that golden throne. Their daily life, while luxurious by medieval standards, was governed by ritual council meetings, religious observations, hunting, and managing their vast personal estates and the affairs of the kingdom. Marriages were political alliances. Children were pawns in dynastic games, and privacy, as we know it, was practically non-existent, especially for the more public figures. Even sleeping arrangements could be quite communal, with courtiers and guards sleeping in the same chambers as the monarch. No, seriously. You'd think the top tier would get some alone time, but medieval life was generally less private than ours, even in the castle. It's a far cry from having your own wing and complaining about the Wi-Fi signal. So, you have the king or queen, often seen as chosen by God, holding ultimate theoretical power, living a life of privilege and responsibility, and sitting precariously atop the entire social structure. Their decisions trickled down, affecting everyone below them. But just beneath this glittering, often turbulent surface were the powerful individuals who helped hold the kingdom together, or sometimes threatened to tear it apart, the great lords and high nobility, our next stop on this historical descent. Stepping down ever so slightly from the lofty, gilded, and probably drafty heights of the royal court, you land among the high nobility. These are the dukes, duchesses, counts, countesses, barons, and baronesses. If the king is the sun in this medieval solar system, these lords are the major planets orbiting around him, but possessing enormous gravity and influence in their own right. Unlike the king, who theoretically owns everything, these individuals actually control vast swathes of land. We're talking territories that could encompass multiple villages, forests, rivers, and maybe even a small town or two. Their wealth is measured not in gold coins tucked under a mattress, but in acres, tenants, and the produce of the land. Imagine arriving at a great baronial castle. It's not quite the sprawling, elaborate complex of the royal palace, but it is formidable. Thick stone walls, imposing towers, may be a moat, though some historians debate how common functional moats actually were outside of illustrations. Maybe they were just for curb appeal. The air here smells cleaner than the peasant track, but perhaps more like horse's leather and roasted meat. You see guards in the Lord's livery servants bustling about their duties, maybe a falconer with a hawk perched on his arm. The noise level is higher than a quiet village filled with the sounds of activity, barking dogs, and the clatter of weaponry. Life here is comfortable, luxurious, even especially when compared to the masses below. The Lord and his family wear clothes made of fine wool, or even imported silk or velvet dyed in vibrant colors that are expensive and hard to produce. They eat multiple courses at meals, enjoying a varied diet of meat-fish game, and produce from their domain the part of the manor controlled directly by the Lord. Their homes, whether castles or large manor houses, are filled with carved furniture, tapestries, and other signs of wealth. They likely have private chapels, extensive stables, kennels for hunting dogs, and perhaps even rudimentary gardens for pleasure as well as food. It's the medieval equivalent of living on a massive estate with a private jet, a personal chef, and a security detail, but with way more fleas. Their position in society wasn't just about personal wealth. It was defined by their relationship to the king through the system of feudalism. These high lords were typically the king's direct vassals. This meant they held their lands, their fief, from the king in exchange for specific obligations. The most important was military service, providing a certain number of knights and soldiers to the king's army when called upon. They also owed counsel attending the king's court to offer advice and participate in major decisions. Failure to meet these obligations could, in theory, result in the forfeiture of their lands, though powerful lords could often defy a weak king. This relationship of lord and vassal service for land and protection is a mainstream historical concept central to understanding the medieval power structure. But their power wasn't just derived from the king. Within their own territories, the high lords were like mini monarchs. They held courts, administered justice, often with life or death power, levied taxes and tolls on the people living on their lands, and maintained their own retinues of knights and soldiers. They were the immediate authority figure for everyone living on their estates, from the lowest serf to the knights who were their vassals. This local power gave them significant leverage, sometimes allowing them to act with considerable independence from the crown. It's like being governor, chief justice, and head of the state militia all rolled into one, but your state is your personal property. A quirky tidbit about the high nobility relates to their leisure activities. While warfare and administration were serious business, they also had elaborate forms of entertainment. Hunting was a favorite pastime, but not just for food. It was a highly ritualized activity with strict rules and etiquette, requiring specialized dogs and trained falcons or hawks. Jousting and tournaments were also popular, providing military training mixed with spectacle, and a chance for knights to win prestige and prizes. These were often elaborate affairs, attracting spectators from various classes, though participation was strictly for the fighting class and involving feasting and celebrations. It wasn't just fun and games. It was a way for the nobility to display their martial prowess, wealth, and social connections. Imagine planning a party where the main event involves heavily armed people trying to knock each other off horses. Quite the mixer. The relationship between the king and these great lords was a constant negotiation, a push and pull of power that shaped the political landscape. Historians still argue whether the feudal system was truly a rigid pyramid with clear lines of authority, or if it was a more chaotic and fluid set of personal relationships and agreements that varied significantly from place to place and time to time. Was it a system at all, or just the messy reality of power dynamics in a decentralized age? This debate highlights the difficulty in applying modern systematic labels to the often informal and personal bonds that defined medieval governance and social order. Marriage was crucial for the high nobility. It wasn't about love. It was about consolidating land wealth and political alliances. Noble families carefully arranged marriages for their children, often from a young age, to strengthen their position and lineage. Inheritance laws, particularly primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited everything, were vital for keeping estates intact and maintaining family power across generations. Losing land through lack of an heir or political missteps was a constant threat, so securing the lineage and expanding influence through strategic marriages was a primary concern. These high lords living in their castles, surrounded by retainers and wealth, held immense power over the lives of thousands of people. They were the intermediaries between the king and the majority of the population, dispensing justice, demanding service, and setting the tone for life within their territories. They fought the king's wars, sat on his councils, and formed the powerful upper crust of the fighting class, distinct from the lesser nobles and knights we'll look at next. Their world was one of privileged power and perpetual political maneuvering. Moving down from the great lords and their sprawling castles, you arrive at the level of the knights and the lesser gentry. These are the backbone of the medieval military, the guys who actually did most of the dangerous pointy work on the battlefield. But they weren't just soldiers. They were also landowners, administrators, and local power brokers, occupying a crucial rung just below the high nobility. Imagine the difference between a corporate CEO and a regional manager. Same company, very different scale of operation and responsibility. You might find yourself approaching a smaller manor house, perhaps fortified, but certainly not a full-blown castle. It might have a stone hall, some wooden outbuildings, maybe a defensive ditch or a palisade. The air here feels a bit more grounded, less opulent than the great castle, but far more comfortable than a peasant hut. You see stables, a training yard, maybe a blacksmith working on armor or weapons. The sounds are likely the ring of hammer on metal, the neighing of horses, and the shouts of squires in training. Knights initially rose to prominence as skilled mounted warriors. The introduction of the stirrup and changes in warfare tactics made heavy cavalry incredibly effective and thus valuable. Over time, this military role solidified into a distinct social status. A man was made a knight through a ceremony often involving a blow on the shoulder with a sword, the accolade. Becoming a knight was expensive, requiring training armor, weapons, and war horses. To support this, knights were typically granted land, a manor or a smaller estate, by a higher lord in exchange for their military service and loyalty. This grant of land, a smaller fief, was their economic base, providing income, rent, and labor from peasants to maintain their equipment and lifestyle. This system, where land was granted in exchange for military service, is a mainstream historical understanding of how the knightly class was supported within the feudal framework. Life as a knight wasn't just about charging into battle, although that was a significant part of their identity. A knight was expected to manage his manor, oversee his tenants, and administer justice in his local court according to the customs of the manor and the laws of his lord and the king. He was the immediate authority figure for the villagers on his land, resolving disputes, punishing minor crimes, and ensuring everyone fulfilled their obligations. He was also expected to train regularly, keeping his fighting skills sharp and maintaining his expensive equipment. It was a demanding role, requiring a mix of military readiness, administrative capability, and a fair amount of time spent looking after horses. Compared to the high nobility, the knight's landholding was much smaller, and his wealth considerably less. He didn't command hundreds of other knights. He might have a few squires and sergeants serving him. His manor house, while comfortable, wasn't a seat of regional power like a duke's castle. Yet compared to the peasants, he lived a life of immense privilege. He didn't work the fields, at least not with his own hands. He ate well, wore relatively fine clothes, though likely more practical than the High Lord's silks, and possessed weapons, a horse and armor. Symbols of his status and power that set him apart entirely from the working class. A modern aside, think of a knight's training regimen and constant need for expensive gear. It's kind of like being a professional athlete combined with being a small business owner. But your sport is deadly, and your business involves telling peasants what to do and hoping they don't revolt. Plus, imagine the equipment costs. That armor wasn't cheap, and you couldn't just order it on Amazon Prime. There's a quirky tidbit about the code of chivalry associated with knights. While we often think of chivalry as being about politeness, romance, and helping damsels in distress, thanks Hollywood in the medieval context, it was primarily a code of conduct among the knightly class. It emphasized military prowess, courage, loyalty to one's lord, and honor in battle. It also had religious undertones, encouraging knights to protect the church and the weak, though this was often more honored in the breach than the observance. There were even specific rituals and oaths involved in the dubbing ceremony, where a squire became a knight, swearing to uphold these ideals. It was an attempt to civilize a warrior class and give their violence a moral framework, though battlefield realities often meant these ideals went out the window pretty quickly. Historians still argue about the extent to which knights actually adhered to the code of chivalry. Was it a genuine ethical guide, or more of a literary ideal promoted in romances and chronicles, with the reality of medieval warfare and politics being much more brutal and pragmatic? This scholarly debate highlights the gap between the aspirational image of the noble knight and the often harsh necessities of survival and power in the Middle Ages. Did they really stop to help every traveler in need? Or were they mostly focused on collecting rents and bashing heads when necessary? The knight's life was a balancing act, serving his lord, managing his estate, dispensing local justice training for war, and trying to maintain his status and honor within the complex hierarchy of the nobility. He was a vital link in the feudal chain, connecting the great lords to the land and the people who worked it. This military landholding class formed the broad base of the Those Who Fight group, but they weren't the only ones with significant influence and a privileged position. Parallel to this military aristocracy, but with a very different kind of power, stood the church and its own intricate hierarchy. So you've got the king at the pinnacle, the great lords with their vast lands, and the knights managing their manors and ready for battle. But medieval society wasn't just about land and fighting. It was also profoundly shaped by faith, and that brings us to the third major order, the clergy, those who pray. The church wasn't just a building you visited on Sunday. It was a colossal institution, a parallel power structure that permeated every level of society, and its members formed a distinct and highly varied social class all their own. Imagine walking towards a village church. It might be small, simple, made of stone or even wood. Or perhaps you see a much larger structure in a town, a grand cathedral rising imposingly above the other buildings, its bells ringing out across the rooftops. The air around these places might smell of incense, old stone, and perhaps dampness. Inside, it's often cooler, quieter, filled with the faint scent of candle wax and reverence. Here live and work the members of the clergy, from the humble village priest to the powerful bishop. The primary role of the clergy, regardless of rank, was spiritual. They were the intermediaries between God and the people. They performed the sacraments, those essential rituals believed to be necessary for salvation, like baptism, communion, the Eucharist, confession, marriage, last rites, and others. Without the clergy, people believed their souls were in peril. This gave priests and other churchmen immense influence over the lives of individuals from birth to death. The church calendar dictated the rhythm of the year, with feast days and fast days marking time more surely than the changing seasons. This central role of the sacraments and the church in the spiritual lives of medieval people is a mainstream historical fact. It was the bedrock of their worldview. But the church was far more than just a spiritual guide. It was also a major political and economic power. The church owned vast amounts of land, often granted by pious nobles seeking favor with God, or perhaps just tax breaks, who knows. Abbeys and monasteries controlled enormous estates worked by peasants, just like secular lords' manors. Bishops and abbots were often powerful landowners themselves, holding temporal as well as spiritual authority, sometimes ruling over territories as large as those of great secular lords. They had their own courts applying canon law, church law, which dealt not only with religious matters, but also with issues like marriage, inheritance, and even certain crimes committed by clergy or on church lands. Joining the clergy offered one of the few potential pathways for social mobility in the medieval world, although it wasn't a guarantee of rising to the top. Unlike nobility, which was determined by birth, entry into the clergy required some degree of education or at least patronage. A bright peasant boy might learn to read and write at a local monastery and potentially rise through the ranks. A younger son of a noble family not set to inherit land might find a prestigious career path in the church hierarchy. However, the highest positions, bishoprics, abbacies, were often filled by members of noble families, showing that even within the church, social background frequently played a significant role. It's a bit like having an open application process for entry-level jobs, but all the senior executive positions seem to mysteriously go to people whose parents are already on the board. Beyond their spiritual and economic roles, the clergy were also the keepers of knowledge. Monasteries in particular were centers of learning and literacy, where monks copied manuscripts, kept records, and studied ancient texts. They were the libraries and universities of their day, preserving classical learning and contributing to medieval scholarship. This intellectual function added another layer to the clergy's importance and set them apart from the largely illiterate secular population, both noble and peasant. A quirky tidbit about medieval monasteries involves their daily schedule. Monastic life was highly regimented, following a strict timetable of prayer work and study known as the divine office. Monks would wake in the middle of the night for the first service matins, followed by lauds at dawn, and then services roughly every 3 hours throughout the day, prime terce, sext none, finishing with vespers in the late afternoon and compline before bed. It was a life dedicated almost entirely to prayer and contemplation, punctuated by manual labor or scholarly work. Imagine having a schedule dictated by a bell ringing 9 times a day starting in the middle of the night. Definitely not a 9-to-5 gig, or even a 24/7 gig, more like a 24 divine office gig. The medieval church was a vast and complex organization, and like any large institution, it had its share of challenges. Historians still argue extensively about the level of piety and genuine religious devotion within the medieval church hierarchy compared to instances of corruption, worldly ambition, and moral failings. Was the average bishop a truly devout man dedicated to his flock, or a political operator more concerned with wealth and power? This scholarly debate highlights the difficulty in making sweeping judgments about such a diverse group over a long period. The clergy, therefore, weren't just a religious group. They were a distinct social class with their own hierarchy, wealth, power, and unique roles that intersected with and often rivaled the secular authorities. They provided the spiritual framework for society-preserved learning, administered large estates, and offered a different, though often still class-influenced path in life. Their position was unique, occupying a space sometimes above and sometimes alongside the secular nobility, but always profoundly separate from the working masses. We'll delve deeper into the structure within this clerical class next, so you understand that the clergy formed a distinct and powerful layer in medieval society, separate from the secular nobles and peasants. But just saying the clergy is like saying the government today. It covers a vast range of roles, responsibilities, and crucially levels of power and privilege. Within the church itself, there was a deeply entrenched hierarchy, its own internal class system, ranging from the absolute pinnacle of the Pope down to the humble parish priest or lay brother. At the very peak, though often physically distant from your daily life unless you lived in Rome, was the Pope. Considered the successor of St. Peter, the Pope was the head of the entire Catholic Church, wielding immense spiritual authority and at times considerable political power, even challenging kings and emperors. Below him were the cardinals, his chief advisors, who also had the weighty responsibility of electing the next pope. These were men of high status, often drawn from noble families or rising through the ranks via intellect and political savvy. Think of them as the Pope's cabinet, an electoral college rolled into one dressed in very nice red robes. Moving down, you come to the archbishops and bishops. These were the regional leaders of the church overseeing dioceses' large church administrative areas. A bishop was a hugely important figure, not just spiritually, but also socially and economically. Bishops often controlled vast estates granted to their bishoprics, making them powerful landowners and temporal lords in their own right, much like secular dukes or counts. They sat in royal councils, had their own courts, and commanded significant resources. A bishop lived in a grand palace, attached to his cathedral, enjoyed a lavish lifestyle comparable to high nobility, and was a major player in both church and state politics. You'd likely see a bishop traveling with a large retinue, looking every bit the powerful lord he was. Parallel to the hierarchy of bishops and priests, known as the secular clergy, because they lived in seculo in the world, was the hierarchy of the regular clergy, those who lived according to a regula or rule in enclosed communities. These were the monks and nuns living in monasteries and convents. The heads of these communities The abbots and abbesses could also be incredibly powerful and wealthy, especially if their abbey or convent controlled extensive lands. Some abbeys were like independent economic powerhouses, centers of production trade and learning, and their abbots were major figures in regional politics and church councils. An abbot might live in considerable comfort, managing the abbey's estates and affairs, overseeing hundreds of monks and lay brothers, and entertaining noble guests. Now step further down the ladder. Below, the bishops were the priests, and the most common priest you'd encounter was the parish priest. He was the spiritual leader of a village or a small town, living much closer to the level of his parishioners. His church might be modest, his dwelling simple, and his income derived from tithes, a portion of the villager's produce, or income and fees for services like marriages and funerals. His life was one of ministering to his flock, performing daily mass, offering confession, providing basic education sometimes, and acting as a moral guide. His existence was far removed from the political maneuvering and wealth of a bishop or abbot. He was the frontline worker of the church, living among the common people he served. At the bottom of the regular clergy hierarchy were the ordinary monks, nuns, friars who lived and preached among the people owning no property, and lay brothers or sisters who did the manual labor in monasteries. Their lives varied depending on their order: Benedictine, Cistercian, Franciscan, etc., each with its own rule and the wealth of their house. A monk in a rich abbey might spend his days copying manuscripts in a heated scriptorium, while a lay brother in a poor monastery might be doing heavy manual labor in the fields. Nuns lived cloistered lives dedicated to prayer and work within their convent walls. Their lives were often austere, disciplined, and focused inwards on their spiritual devotion, a stark contrast to the worldly concerns of the higher clergy. The structure of the medieval Catholic Church, with its distinct ranks and clear lines of authority culminating in the Pope, is a mainstream historical concept. This hierarchical organization allowed the Church to exert widespread influence across Europe, manage its vast resources, and maintain doctrinal consistency, at least in theory. A quirky tidbit: while most monks and nuns lived disciplined lives, medieval chronicles and records sometimes contain amusing to us accounts of less than pious behavior within monasteries. Monks sneaking out excessive feasting arguments over property and other very human failings that suggest monastic life wasn't always the serene idyll depicted in stained glass windows. It turns out, even dedicating your life to God didn't always make you immune to petty squabbles or a craving for better food. Historians still argue about the practical limits of papal authority in the Middle Ages. While the Pope was the theoretical head, his actual ability to enforce his will in distant kingdoms often depended on the political situation, the power of local rulers, and the willingness of bishops and archbishops to obey. Was the Pope truly the supreme ruler of the Church on a day-to-day basis? Or were bishops and abbots largely independent operators within their own spheres? This scholarly debate reminds us that medieval power structures, even within the seemingly rigid Church, were often more decentralized and subject to local realities than the official hierarchy might suggest. So within the single broad category of clergy, you had a vast spectrum of experience, from the international power broker living in a palace to the village priest sharing the struggles of his flock and the monk dedicating his silent life to prayer within cloister walls. Their shared identity was their religious calling, but their social status, wealth, and daily realities were profoundly different, creating a distinct hierarchy within the spiritual layer of medieval society. Now, we leave the world of those who pray and those who fight and descend to the vast majority those who work. Okay, we've explored the folks at the top, the rulers, the fighters, the prayers. Now let's talk about the vast, overwhelming majority of people in the medieval world. We're descending from the stone castles and quiet cloisters and returning to the fields and villages. This is the world of the peasants, the toilers, the people who worked the land and literally fed everyone else. If medieval society was a pyramid, these people formed the massive essential base. Estimates vary, but something like 80 to 90% of the population belonged to this class. Without them, the nobles would starve, the clergy would have no one to preach to, and the king would rule over empty fields. Imagine yourself, now, in a small medieval village. The air smells earthy of soil animals, wood smoke, and maybe the ever-present scent of dampness. Your home is likely small, perhaps just 1 or 2 rooms made of timber, or wattle, and daub a mix of mud straw and animal dung. Remember that lovely material with a thatched roof. There's a hearth in the center for cooking and warmth, the smoke finding its way out through a hole in the roof, or maybe just permeating everything. Possessions are few and functional. A simple table, stool, straw mattresses for sleeping, perhaps a few pots and tools. Comfort is a luxury, not a given. Your life and the life of almost everyone around you revolves around the agricultural cycle. Planting in spring, tending crops in summer, harvesting in autumn, and trying to survive the lean winter. You are intimately connected to the land. Your success and survival dependent on the weather, the fertility of the soil, and your own backbreaking labor. This fundamental reality that the vast majority of the population were peasants engaged in subsistence agriculture is a mainstream historical fact that shaped medieval life more than almost anything else. Your daily rhythm is dictated by the sun rising and setting, the seasons turning, and the endless demands of farming. Village life is communal. Your neighbors are also your fellow laborers. You work together in the fields, share tools, sometimes help each other build homes, and celebrate festivals together. There's a strong sense of community born out of necessity and shared hardship. The village church is often the center of social life, a place for worship gatherings, announcements, and celebrations. You know everyone and everyone knows you. There's little privacy, but also a strong network of mutual support. Think of it as living in a tiny rural commune where everyone's livelihood depends on everyone else pulling their weight in the mud. Within the peasant class, there were variations, though these distinctions might seem minor compared to the gulf between a peasant and a noble. There were free peasants who owned or rented their land and owed rent or labor service to a lord, but had more personal freedom and rights. And there were serfs who were tied to the land and had significantly more obligations to their lord with fewer freedoms. We'll get into the joys of serfdom specifically in the next section. But for now, picture the general peasant, hard-working, rooted in their village, and fundamentally reliant on the land. A modern aside. Imagine your job security and food source depending entirely on whether it rains enough, but not too much, if pests decide to eat your entire year's work, or if the local lord is having a bad day and decides to demand extra labor. Talk about high-stakes agriculture. And working from home wasn't a perk. It was just where you lived and worked. No commute, though, unless you count the walk to the field. A quirky tidbit about medieval peasant life involves their calendar of work and rest. While we might think of it as relentless toil, the medieval year was punctuated by numerous church feast days and saints' days. These weren't just for religious observance. They often provided welcome breaks from labor opportunities for rest celebration and socializing. There were also specific times of the year, like harvest, when the work was incredibly intense, followed by periods of relative quiet. So it wasn't just one long, miserable grind. There were rhythms, intense periods, followed by necessary breaks dictated by the land and the church calendar. Imagine getting a day off because it's St. Bartholomew's feast day, not because it's the weekend. Different priorities. Historians still argue about the degree of agency and independence peasants had within the manorial system. Were they simply passive subjects controlled entirely by their lords, or did they have ways to resist, negotiate, or leverage their essential role? This scholarly debate explores how much freedom of action existed for the vast majority of the population within the constraints of their social and economic position. Did they just accept their lot? Or were they subtly pushing back or finding loopholes where they could? Your life as a peasant is lived close to the earth. Under the authority of a lord, you may rarely see if he's a high noble, or see constantly if he's a knight or lesser lord. Your days are filled with physical labor, your future tied to the success of the harvest, and your social world largely confined to your village and its immediate surroundings. You are essential to the functioning of society, yet you possess the least wealth, the fewest privileges, and the most limited freedom compared to the classes above you. This is the baseline from which the entire medieval social structure operates, built upon the labor of these countless men and women. Next, we'll look specifically at the system that often governed their lives, the manner and the condition of serfdom. So you're living the peasant life tied to the rhythms of the earth in your small village. But for many, especially for those known as serfs, that connection to the land came with a whole list of strings attached, tied up neatly, or maybe not so neatly, in the manorial system. The manor was the basic unit of medieval rural life, the lord's estate. And it wasn't just a collection of fields. It was an entire economic and social world unto itself. Imagine the manor as a self-contained entity. At its heart is the lord's house, the manor house, maybe even a small castle, surrounded by the lord's domain, land worked directly for the lord. Then there are the strips of land, allocated to the peasant families, often scattered across large open fields. There's the village itself with your humble dwelling, maybe a church, a mill, an oven, a blacksmith. And usually there are common lands, pastures for grazing animals, woodlands for gathering firewood, with permission, of course. The air here is a constant mix of farming smells, cooking fires, and animals. As a serf, you weren't owned like a slave. Your person wasn't property that could be bought and sold independently. But you were tied to the land. You couldn't leave the manor without the lord's permission. And if the manor was sold or given to a new lord, you came with it. Your status and your obligations were hereditary. Your children would likely be serfs too. This condition of being legally bound to the soil and owing extensive services to the lord of the manor is a mainstream historical fact that defined the lives of millions in the Middle Ages. It was essentially your permanent address and employment contract all rolled into one with no moving clause. Your obligations as a serf were many and varied. The most significant were labor services on the Lord's domain. This usually involved week work, a certain number of days, each week say 2 or 3 spent working directly on the Lord's fields, planting, weeding, harvesting his crops before you even touched your own. Then there was boon work, extra labor required during busy times like harvest or plowing, when the Lord needed as many hands as possible, often coinciding inconveniently with when your crops also needed urgent attention. Imagine having to help your landlord with their gardening for a few days every week, and then even more when their tomatoes are suddenly ripe. Beyond labor, you owed payments in kind. This meant giving the Lord a portion of your own harvest, sometimes a significant percentage as rent for your landholding. You also owed various fees often referred to as banalities for the mandatory use of the Lord's facilities. You had to take your grain to the Lord's mill to be ground into flour and pay a fee. You had to use the Lord's oven to bake your bread and pay a fee. You might even have to pay a fee to use the Lord's bridge or cross his land with your livestock. These were monopolies that generated income for the Lord and limited your self-sufficiency. Life as a serf also came with personal restrictions. If your daughter wanted to marry someone from outside the manor, you typically needed the Lord's permission and often had to pay a fee, sometimes called merchet. If you died, your heir might have to pay an inheritance fee. Hiriot, often the best beast or piece of goods to the Lord before they could inherit your landholding and your obligations. These weren't arbitrary cruelties. Well, not always, but ways the Lord maintained control over the population and extracted maximum value from his estate and his serfs. It was like a subscription service with mandatory add-ons and a huge cancellation fee for life. Despite these burdens, serfdom did offer a degree of security, at least in theory. You had a right to a plot of land to feed your family, and the Lord was obligated to offer you protection from outside threats like raiders or warring neighbors. In times of famine, the Lord might provide some relief from his own stores. You also had access to the common lands for resources, and you had the right to bring disputes to the manorial court presided over by the Lord or his representative, where issues between villagers or between villagers and the Lord's officials were settled, though justice wasn't always impartial. It was a tough bargain, but it offered a baseline existence in an often insecure world. A modern aside, imagine if your employer owned your house, demanded you work part-time for free on their personal projects, charged you every time you used their kitchen appliances, and required a fee if your kid married someone from a different neighborhood. And you couldn't quit. Makes your current job seem pretty great, right? A quirky tidbit about manorial life involves specific, sometimes peculiar local customs and obligations that varied from manor to manor. Beyond the standard labor and fees, some manors had unique services owed, like helping to repair the Lord's fish pond, providing chickens at certain times of the year, or even ritual services at holidays. These local variations highlight that while the manorial system was widespread, its implementation could be surprisingly diverse, reflecting local traditions and the specific needs or whims of the Lord. It was like a medieval, choose-your-own-adventure of obligations, and you usually ended up with the least fun options. Historians still argue about the origins of serfdom. Was it a gradual evolution from Roman forms of labor, or did it arise more specifically from the chaos and need for local protection after the decline of central authority? This scholarly debate explores the complex historical forces that led to such a significant portion of the European population being bound to the land for centuries. Understanding how it came about helps us understand why it was so deeply entrenched. Living as a serf meant your life was circumscribed by the boundaries of the manor and the authority of your lord. Your labor sustained not only your family, but the entire class structure above you. You had few freedoms, but some basic security. This was the reality for the vast majority, the indispensable foundation upon which the entire medieval social order rested, a life lived close to the earth, dictated by ancient customs and the power of the Lord. But not everyone lived on manors. A new, different kind of life was growing outside the fields in the burgeoning towns. Leaving behind the fields, the quiet, mostly rhythm of the manorial estate, and the obligations of serfdom, you venture towards a different kind of medieval world. One that was growing buzzing and creating entirely new possibilities outside the traditional three orders. This is the world of the town. From the High Middle Ages onwards, particularly from the 11th century, towns and cities began to grow significantly across Europe. While some ancient Roman cities survived, this was a period of new urban development and expansion, driven by a combination of factors like population increase, improved agricultural techniques, meaning fewer people were needed on the land, increased trade, and the need for centers of specialized craft production and protection. Imagine approaching a medieval town. Unlike the scattered houses of a village, you see buildings clustered together, often surrounded by walls for defense. The air changes dramatically as you get closer. It becomes thicker, filled with a cacophony of smells. Wood smoke certainly, but also tanning hides, an unpleasant aroma. Trust me, animal waste sanitation wasn't a strong suit. Cooking food breweries, and the general scent of lots of people living in close proximity. The sounds are overwhelming compared to the quiet countryside carts, rumbling on cobblestones, people shouting in various languages or dialects, church bells ringing constantly, the clang of hammers from workshops, the bleating of sheep being driven to market. It's chaotic, vibrant, and a complete assault on your senses. Entering through the town gate, which would likely be closed and guarded at night, you step into narrow, winding streets. Buildings are packed tightly together, often with upper stories jettied out over the street, almost meeting the building opposite, creating a perpetual twilight below. There are shops, workshops with goods displayed outside taverns, and lots of people milling about. This is a place of commerce, craft, and interaction on a scale you wouldn't find in a village. One of the most significant things about medieval towns was that they offered an escape from the manorial system. A common saying was, Stadtluft macht frei. Town air makes free. If a serf could escape their manor and live undetected in a town for a year and a day, they could often gain their freedom from their lord. This wasn't always easy or safe, but the possibility existed. Towns were places where status wasn't solely determined by birth and landholding. While wealth certainly mattered, skilled craftsmanship and commercial acumen were also routes to success and standing. This offered a potential, albeit difficult, pathway to a different life than the one you were born into in the countryside. The people who lived in towns, the burghers, burgesses, or townspeople, formed a new social class that didn't fit neatly into the traditional division of those who pray fight or work the land. They were engaged in tradescrafts and commerce. They were weavers, bakers, blacksmiths, tanners, shoemakers, merchants, scribes, doctors of varying degrees of competence, let's be honest, and many other specialized professions. Their lives were structured by the town's laws and customs, often governed by a town council or a mayor rather than a feudal lord. They had their own institutions, like guilds, which we'll talk about next. Imagine the energy of a medieval market day. It's loud, crowded, and filled with goods from local farms and distant lands. You can buy bread, cheese, vegetables, meat, but also perhaps fine cloth spices, metal goods, tools, and other items not produced in a village. This was the economic heart of the town, a place where people exchanged goods and money generating wealth that circulated within the urban environment rather than flowing solely up to a distant lord. It's like a medieval shopping mall meets a farmer's market meets a chaotic flea market, and everyone is haggling loudly. A modern aside, medieval towns had some serious infrastructure challenges. Imagine a city with no sewage system, limited clean water sources, and lots of animals roaming the streets. Your commute might be short, but it was probably pretty smelly and required careful foot placement. Also, working from home wasn't really a thing unless your home was your workshop with a living space attached. A quirky tidbit about medieval town life involves the existence of incredibly specific and sometimes bizarre local ordinances or laws. Towns had to regulate everything from waste disposal or lack thereof to the quality of goods, sold noise levels, and public behavior. You might find a town law specifying exactly how wide a street must be, or rather must not be. They were narrow, regulating how many pigs you could let roam free, or fining someone for using dishonest scales at the market. These laws provide a fascinating glimpse into the practical, often messy realities of urban life and the attempts to impose some order on the chaos. Historians still argue about the primary drivers of medieval urban growth. Was it the pull of new economic opportunities in towns, or the push of increasing population pressure and limited land in the countryside? Or was it a combination of factors varying regionally? This scholarly debate highlights the complex forces behind this significant shift in medieval society. The rise of a new kind of wealth and a new class of people living outside the traditional feudal order. Living in a medieval town offered a different kind of existence, crowded, potentially unhealthy, but also vibrant, economically dynamic, and offering a degree of personal freedom and opportunity not found on the manor. You might still be subject to a lord, often the king, or a powerful noble who owned the town charter. But your daily life and social interactions were governed by different rules and centered around craft and commerce. This new urban environment fostered the growth of specific organizations that defined the working lives of townspeople, the guilds. So, you've made it to the town trading the mud and quiet fields for crowded streets and bustling workshops. This new urban world wasn't just a chaotic free-for-all. It had its own structures, its own hierarchies, and its own powerful organizations. Central to the lives of medieval townspeople were the guilds. Essentially, the medieval equivalents of professional associations, trade unions, and social clubs all rolled into one, sometimes with a hint of organized crime thrown in for flavor. Walk down a street lined with workshops, and you'll see signs, or maybe just the goods themselves, indicating the trade, the baker, the blacksmith, the weaver, the tailor, the shoemaker, the tanner. Hold your nose again. These trades were organized into craft guilds. If you wanted to work in a specific trade, you had to belong to the guild. The guild controlled who could practice the craft, how they were trained, the quality standards for the goods produced, and often the price they could charge. This regulation of craft production was a mainstream historical feature of medieval urban economies designed to protect members, ensure quality theoretically, and prevent outside competition. It was like a highly regulated industry, where the industry itself made the rules. The structure within a craft guild was itself a mini hierarchy. At the bottom was the apprentice. Typically, a young boy girls were usually excluded from most craft guilds, though female artisans existed often alongside male family members. He would be bound to a master for several years, living in the master's household, learning the trade, and receiving food, lodging, and training instead of wages. It was like an intense live-in vocational school with a very demanding teacher. After completing his apprenticeship, he would become a journeyman. A journeyman was a skilled worker who could earn wages by working for different masters. The word journeyman comes from the French word for déjeuner, as they were paid by the day. To become a master himself, a journeyman usually had to produce a masterpiece, a piece of work demonstrating his skill, and gain the approval of the existing masters, and often pay a hefty fee. Becoming a master meant you could open your own workshop, train apprentices, and become a full voting member of the guild with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. It was the ultimate career goal, the medieval equivalent of making partner or owning your own successful business. Alongside the craft guilds were the even more powerful merchant guilds. These guilds controlled trade within the town and with the outside world. They negotiated with other towns, regulated weights and measures, provided security for merchants traveling with goods, and often dominated town politics. Merchants, especially those involved in long-distance trade, could accumulate considerable wealth, far exceeding that of most craftsmen, and certainly dwarfing the income of peasants or even many knights. They dealt in valuable commodities like wool-cloth, spices, wine, and luxury goods. This accumulation of mobile wealth based on commerce, rather than just land, was a new and increasingly significant source of power in medieval society. The wealthiest merchants often formed an urban elite, sometimes called the patriciate. They built large houses in town, held positions on the town council, and intermarried with other wealthy merchant families. While they didn't have inherited titles like the nobility, their wealth and control over the town's economy gave them significant social standing and political influence. They were the medieval entrepreneurs and capitalists figuring out how to make money through trade and exchange. Think of them as the medieval venture capitalists. But instead of investing in tech startups, they were investing in shiploads of wine or bolts of imported cloth. Guilds weren't just about work. They also had important social and religious functions. They often had patron saints, held religious processions, provided welfare for sick or elderly members and their families, and ensured members received a proper burial. They were a crucial part of the social fabric of the town, providing a sense of identity, community, and mutual support beyond the immediate family. It was like a union, a social club, and a mutual aid society rolled into one, with mandatory attendance at feasts, the fun part. A quirky tidbit about guilds is the sometimes elaborate and boisterous nature of their feasts and ceremonies. Guilds loved a good party. Joining a guild often involved an initiation ceremony, and guild meetings were frequently followed by feasting and drinking. These events reinforced group identity, celebrated success, and provided opportunities for networking medieval style. Some guilds even had their own halls richly decorated, serving as meeting places and symbols of their collective wealth and power. Imagine your company picnic involving ceremonial robes, a lot of ale, and singing songs about the glorious history of candlestick making. Historians still argue about the overall economic impact of guilds. Did they foster high-quality production and economic stability by regulating trade and training skilled workers? Or did they stifle innovation and competition by limiting entry into trades and controlling prices? This scholarly debate highlights the dual nature of guilds as both protectors of standards and potential barriers to economic growth, depending on how rigidly they enforced their rules. Within the town walls, therefore, a complex social structure existed, distinct from the rural hierarchy. Wealthy merchants stood at the top, followed by master craftsmen, then journeymen, and finally apprentices and unskilled laborers at the bottom of the urban ladder. While it wasn't a system based purely on birth climbing, this ladder still required skill, opportunity, and often money. It was a world of different opportunities and challenges compared to the manner driven by tradecraft and the power of the guild. The town was a dynamic force, changing the social landscape and offering new possibilities for those who dared to leave the land behind. So we've laid out the layers, the rulers, the fighters, the prayers, and the vast majority of toilers on the land, with a new, bustling class emerging in the towns. This was a society where, for most people, your social standing was pretty much determined the moment you were born. If your parents were peasants, you'd likely be a peasant. Born noble, you'd likely stay noble. It was a world built on inherited status, not on the idea that anyone could grow up to be president or even just own a slightly bigger mud hut. However, while rare and exceptionally difficult, it wasn't totally impossible to shift your station in medieval life. There were a few narrow, often precarious paths for social mobility. Think of it less like climbing a ladder with clearly defined rungs, and more like trying to scramble up a very steep, muddy bank with very few handholds. Success often depended on a combination of luck, exceptional talent patronage, and being in the right place at the right, often chaotic time. For most people, the idea of drastically changing their social class was likely an unthinkable fantasy, like owning a flying horse or having reliable indoor plumbing. Okay, maybe reliable indoor plumbing was more of a fantasy. One of the most consistent, albeit limited, avenues for upward mobility was through the church. As we touched upon earlier, unlike the nobility, which was based on birthright, the church theoretically offered advancement based on merit, piety, and crucially literacy and education. A bright boy from a peasant family might be noticed by a local priest or monk taken and taught to read and write Latin and begin climbing the ecclesiastical ladder, while the highest positions, bishops, abbots, were often filled by members of noble families due to connections and patronage. It wasn't unheard of for men of humbler origins to rise to positions of considerable importance within the church hierarchy, managing large estates, advising powerful lords, or becoming respected scholars. This path, offering advancement through intellectual ability and religious service, is a mainstream historical fact about medieval society. It was still a long shot, but it was a shot. Another potential path, primarily for men lay in military service. Exceptional bravery or skill in warfare could attract the notice of a lord or even the king. A particularly valiant soldier of humble origins might be rewarded with land grants of money, or even the prestigious and expensive honor of being made a knight. This was often more possible during periods of conflict or expansion, where military success was highly valued and new territories needed to be administered. However, it was also incredibly dangerous. You might gain a knighthood, or you might just gain a fatal sword wound. High risk, potentially high reward, very low life expectancy. It's like investing in a very volatile stock where the dividend is land and the risk is well dying. In the burgeoning towns, as we discussed, a different kind of mobility emerged based on wealth and skill rather than landholding. A successful merchant could accumulate significant wealth through trade buying property in town and even lending money, though the church frowned on usury, people still did it. This wealth could translate into social standing within the urban community, allowing a merchant family to live a life of comfort and influence. Over generations, a wealthy merchant family might acquire land, adopt some of the customs of the lower nobility, and eventually even intermarry with minor gentry, effectively blurring the lines and moving into the lower ranks of the fighting class, but through economic means, not birth. Similarly, becoming a highly skilled and prosperous master craftsman could lead to a comfortable life and respect within the town, and gild a significant step up from rural poverty. There were other, even less common ways to potentially alter your circumstances. Entering royal or noble service as an administrator or scribe, if you were literate, could offer advancement and influence. Becoming a renowned artisan whose skills were sought after by the elite could bring patronage and a better living. Even in desperate circumstances, becoming an outlaw in a forest might offer a brutal kind of freedom and opportunity for gain through robbery. Though this was a dangerous and socially marginalized existence, think Robin Hood, but probably less merry and with more mud. The obstacles to mobility were immense. Lack of education was a primary barrier for the vast majority. Serfs were often legally bound to their land, requiring their lord's permission, and likely a hefty payment or service to leave, which lords were often reluctant to grant, as it meant losing valuable labor. Connections and patronage were often essential, meaning those with existing ties to power had a significant advantage. And there was simply the ingrained social prejudice. Someone of humble birth, even if they acquired wealth or status, might still be looked down upon by the old aristocracy. It was like trying to join a very exclusive club, where your membership application was mostly judged on who your great-great-grandparents were. A quirky tidbit about medieval mobility relates to certain specific professions that seem to exist slightly outside the rigid class lines. Performers, minstrels, jongleurs. These individuals often traveled between noble courts and towns, entertaining people of all classes. While not necessarily high status, their itinerant lifestyle and reliance on skill and patronage gave them a unique position, sometimes allowing them access to circles normally closed to them and offering a living different from farming or traditional crafts. They weren't quite noble, not quite clergy, not quite peasant, and not quite typical townspeople. Sort of the medieval equivalent of traveling entertainers, or maybe early stand-up comedians navigating a complex social world on charm and talent. Historians still argue extensively about the actual extent of social mobility in the Middle Ages. Was it genuinely possible for significant numbers of people to move between classes? Or were these just a few isolated exceptions that didn't change the overall static nature of society? This scholarly debate delves into interpreting limited historical records and trying to quantify social movement in a world very different from our own, grappling with questions like whether accumulating wealth truly meant changing class or just gaining influence within your existing layer. So while the medieval world was largely defined by fixed social classes, there were cracks in the facade, narrow pathways carved out by the church military necessity and the burgeoning urban economy. These paths were difficult, required luck and talent, and were not available to everyone. but they offered a glimmer of possibility, a chance, however slim, to move beyond the station into which you were born, making the social structure slightly less rigid than it appeared on the surface. However, even with these possibilities, the different classes lived very different lives, marked by distinctions that were often reinforced by law and custom. So while there were these narrow cracks, offering limited social mobility through the church military service or the hustle of town life, the prevailing forces in medieval society worked tirelessly to maintain the existing class structure. Beyond the ingrained customs and economic realities we've discussed, the law itself played a significant role in codifying and enforcing these divisions. Medieval legal codes weren't about universal equality before the law. They were designed to reflect and uphold the hierarchical nature of society. One of the most visible ways the law reinforced class was through sumptuary laws. These were regulations that dictated what people were allowed to wear based on their social rank, wealth, or profession. The purpose was clear: to prevent people from dressing above their station, to make class distinctions immediately obvious through appearance, and to limit conspicuous consumption, especially by the newly wealthy merchant class who might be able to afford luxuries traditionally reserved for the nobility. The existence of sumptuary laws aimed at regulating dress and consumption according to social status is a mainstream historical fact across medieval Europe. It's like the government telling you your income bracket determines whether you're allowed to wear designer clothes or have certain car features. Imagine standing in a medieval market or attending a public event. Sumptuary laws meant you could often tell someone's general social standing just by looking at their clothes. Only the highest nobility might be allowed to wear certain expensive furs like ermine or sable. The use of vibrant, costly dyes like deep purple or certain reds derived from complex processes might be restricted to the elite. Fabrics like silk or velvet were usually out of reach and legally forbidden. For the lower classes, who were limited to simpler wools, linens, or hemp in muted, undyed, or simply dyed colors. Specific items like elaborate belts, certain types of hats, or excessive jewelry could also be regulated by status. These laws made sure that even if a wealthy merchant could afford that bolt of crimson silk, he might not be legally allowed to wear it, visibly reinforcing that wealth alone didn't grant you the status of noble birth. The legal system also treated people differently based on their class. The value of a person's oath or testimony in court could vary according to their status. Punishments for the same crime could be vastly different depending on whether the offender was a noble, a free person, a serf, or a member of the clergy. Fines might be levied differently, or corporal punishments might be reserved for the lower orders, while nobles might face imprisonment or loss of land or title for similar offenses. The idea was that harming a person of higher status was a more serious offense than harming someone of lower status, and that people of higher status deserved more honorable forms of punishment, i.e., less likely to involve public flogging or mutilation. This differential treatment under the law underscored the inherent inequality baked into the system. Remember how serfs were subject to their lord's court. That's a prime example of a legal system reinforcing dependency based on status. Laws also restricted the rights and freedoms of specific groups. For serfs, laws or manorial customs that had the force of law dictated their inability to leave the manor without permission, their obligation to use the lord's mill or oven, and the fees they owed upon marriage or inheritance. For peasants in general, hunting laws often reserved forests and game for the nobility, making poaching a serious offense, even if you were just trying to feed your family. These laws weren't just about property rights. They were about reinforcing the nobility's privileged access to resources and leisure activities, fundamentally setting them apart from the working class. It was like having a law that says only billionaires are allowed to play golf, and everyone else has to stick to miniature golf and pay a fee to use the putter. A modern aside. Imagine if the government passed laws saying only people earning over $500K a year are allowed to wear cashmere or drive cars that aren't beige. And if you broke the speed limit, your punishment depended on your tax bracket. Sounds wild, right? But that's essentially what medieval sumptuary and class-based laws were doing. A quirky tidbit: some sumptuary laws got incredibly specific, even dictating details like the length of shoe points or the amount of fabric allowed in a woman's dress, sometimes as a way to curb extravagance following crises like the Black Death, which we'll get to later. For example, there were laws in various places regulating the length of the pointed toes on men's shoes, called poulains or crackles, with longer points supposedly restricted to higher social ranks, trying to enforce shoe point length based on social class. Now that's micromanagement. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of these sumptuary laws. Were they strictly enforced, or were they more like aspirational guidelines often ignored or only occasionally cracked down upon? Did people find ways around them? This scholarly debate considers how much impact these laws actually had on everyday behavior, versus simply serving as a legal declaration of the existing social order and the anxieties about that order being disrupted perhaps by upwardly mobile townspeople. Ultimately, medieval laws were not designed to create a level playing field. They were instruments used by those in power, kings, nobles, church officials, to maintain the status quo, reinforce the privileges of the elite, and ensure that everyone, especially the vast working class, stayed in their designated place. These legal distinctions weren't just theoretical. They had real-world consequences for how you lived, what you wore, and how you were treated by the justice system. These tangible differences in daily life, shaped by both custom and law, are what truly brought the class distinctions to life for medieval people. Beyond the grand pronouncements of kings, the clang of knights' armor, the chants of the clergy, the endless toil of peasants, and the bustling noise of towns. What did class distinction actually feel like in the messy, everyday reality of medieval life? It wasn't just about legal status or political power. It profoundly shaped the most basic aspects of your existence: what you ate, where you slept, what you wore, how healthy you were, and how, or if you ever relaxed. Imagine your dinner. If you're a peasant, it's likely a hearty pottage, a thick stew made of grains like oats or barley vegetables, cabbage onions, leeks beans, and maybe some peas. Bread, usually a coarse dark loaf made from rye or barley, is a staple. Meat is a rare luxury, maybe some salt pork saved from the one pig your family might own, or if you're lucky and not caught poaching, some small game. Dairy products like cheese and milk might be available if you have a cow, or goats. Your diet is monotonous, heavily reliant on carbohydrates, and often just enough to sustain the heavy physical labor you perform daily. Contrast this with the noble's table: multiple courses featuring roasted meats, beef, pork, venison, poultry, fish, fresh or preserved fine white bread made from wheat, imported spices, pepper, ginger, cloves, fruits fresh and dried nuts, and plenty of wine or ale. The sheer variety and richness are staggering compared to the peasant diet. The clergy's diet varied. Monks in wealthy monasteries might eat very well, sometimes controversially, so despite vows of austerity, while a poor parish priest likely ate more simply closer to his flock's level. Townspeople's diets varied by wealth. A master craftsman ate better than a laborer, with access to a wider variety of goods available in the market. The stark difference in diet by class is a mainstream historical understanding. You literally ate your social status. Now think about where you live. As a peasant, your home is a simple, small structure of 1 or 2 rooms. It's likely dark smoky, from the central hearth drafty, and shared not only with your family, but often with your livestock during the colder months for warmth. Possessions are few. Privacy, as we understand it, is non-existent. Move up to a knight's manor house, larger, maybe stone and timber, with separate rooms for eating, the hall, sleeping chambers, still potentially shared by multiple family members or retainers, and perhaps a solar or private room for the lord and lady. There's more space, better furniture, maybe tapestries for insulation and decoration. Go higher to a great lord's castle or a bishop's palace, multiple large halls, private chambers, chapels, guard rooms, kitchens, stables, servants' quarters. These are complex, multifunctional buildings designed for defense administration and comfortable by medieval standards, living for a large household. Urban houses varied greatly, from the wealthy merchant's multi-story home with a shop below to the cramped shared lodgings of laborers or apprentices. Housing was a clear visual indicator of class. Clothing, beyond the legal restrictions of sumptuary laws, also reflected daily life. A peasant's clothes were practical, durable, made of rough materials and designed for labor. They were likely undyed or in simple earth tones, mended repeatedly until they fell apart. A noble's clothes were impractical for manual work, made of fine, often brightly colored fabrics, layered and designed to display wealth and status rather than function. Keeping these clothes clean and maintained required servants. Clergy wore distinctive robes or habits, depending on their order or rank, signaling their religious status. Townspeople's clothing varied by profession and wealth, from the sturdy clothes of a craftsman to the finer garments of a successful merchant. Hygiene and health were major concerns for all classes, but access to resources differed. Sanitation was poor everywhere by modern standards. Remember those town smells, but nobles and wealthy clergy might have access to private latrines or bathing facilities. Though full immersion, bathing wasn't a daily ritual for anyone. Peasants and the urban poor lived in close proximity to waste, and animals, increasing their vulnerability to disease. Healthcare was rudimentary and often intertwined with superstition and religious belief. While the wealthy might be able to afford the services of a physician whose knowledge was limited, the poor relied on folk remedies. The local wise woman, or the often basic care provided by monasteries or hospitals, which were more like hospices for the dying than modern hospitals. Sickness and death were ever-present realities for everyone, but the poor faced higher risks and had fewer resources to cope. Historians still argue about the average lifespan and health outcomes for different medieval classes. While challenging to track precisely, evidence suggests the poor often had harder lives, but perhaps were less susceptible to certain diseases of affluence or the dangers of warfare faced by the nobility. Finally, leisure time was dictated by the demands of work and status. For peasants, true leisure was rare, confined mostly to Sundays and church festivals. When they did relax, it might be simple games, dancing, drinking ale, or storytelling in the village. Nobles whose work involved administration politics and warfare had specific leisure pursuits, hunting a major time-consuming activity, feasting tournaments, playing board games like chess or backgammon, listening to music or stories from minstrels and hawking. Clergy's leisure was often tied to religious activities study or managing their estates, though some monks engaged in scholarly pursuits or gardening. Townspeople's leisure might involve visiting taverns, participating in town festivals, playing games, or attending local entertainment. Your relaxation, like your food and clothing, was often a marker of your place in the social hierarchy. A quirky tidbit: while peasants ate a lot of grains and vegetables, they were also often avid foragers. They supplemented their diet with nuts, berries, roots, and other wild edibles gathered from forests and common lands, knowledge passed down through generations. This resourcefulness was essential for survival and highlights a connection to the natural environment that the higher classes relying on purchased or produced food might have lacked. It's like their version of foraging for wild mushrooms, but if their survival depended on it. Living in the Middle Ages meant that your class wasn't an abstract concept. It was the tangible reality of your everyday existence. It shaped the roof over your head, the food on your plate, the clothes on your back, the illnesses you were likely to face, and the ways you were allowed to spend the few moments you had free from labor or obligation. These profound differences in daily life were the constant lived experience of the medieval social hierarchy. But even in this seemingly rigid world, events sometimes occurred that shook the foundations and challenged the established order. We've looked at the layers of medieval society, the daily realities of life within those layers, and even the rare instances where individuals might shift their position. Now, let's consider one of the most fundamental ways families work to preserve or enhance their social standing over generations through marriage and inheritance. In the medieval world, marriage was often much more than a union of two individuals. It was a crucial social, economic, and political contract between families. For the nobility, marriage was a key tool for maintaining and increasing power, wealth, and influence. Marriages were typically arranged often when the individuals were still children or young teenagers by their parents or guardians. The goal was rarely personal affection, though that could hopefully develop. It was about forging alliances between powerful families, consolidating land holdings, resolving disputes, or gaining political advantage. A strategic marriage could bring vast new territories under a lord's control, or provide valuable military support. Imagine negotiating a corporate merger, but the assets being exchanged are entire counties, and the key players are teenagers who just met. Arranged marriages, particularly among the elite for political and economic gain, are a mainstream historical fact that profoundly shaped the medieval landscape. Inheritance practices were equally vital for the nobility. To prevent the fragmentation of estates and the dilution of family power, practices like primogeniture became common in many areas where the eldest son inherited the vast majority, if not all, of the land and titles. This meant younger sons had to find alternative paths, often in the church or military service. Remember those limited avenues for mobility. Daughters were valuable for the alliances they could secure through marriage and their dowry assets provided by the bride's family to the groom, or his family was a key part of the marriage negotiation. Producing legitimate male heirs was paramount for the survival and continuation of the noble lineage and its land base. the pressure to pop out a son must have been intense. For wealthy merchants in towns, marriage was also a strategic affair, though the currency was commerce and capital rather than just land. Merchant families arranged marriages to consolidate business interests, form partnerships, and pass on wealth and commercial connections. Marrying into another successful merchant family could double your trading network or capital reserves. As their wealth grew successful, merchant families might also seek to marry their children into landowning gentry families, using their urban wealth to acquire rural status and potentially pave the way for their descendants to enter the lower ranks of the nobility. This was one of the key ways urban wealth could translate into a shift in social standing over generations. Even among peasants, marriage had practical considerations beyond personal affection. While peasants likely had more say in choosing a spouse than high nobles, economic realities played a huge role. A marriage meant combining labor and resources, perhaps pooling together small land holdings, or securing access to additional working hands for the family plot. The timing of a marriage might depend on when a couple could afford to set up their own household or acquire access to enough land to support a family. And for serfs, as we mentioned, marriage could be complicated by manorial rules, requiring the lord's permission, especially if one partner was from a different manor, and potentially involving a marriage fee. Love was probably a nice bonus, but making sure you could actually feed yourselves was likely the primary consideration. The dowry, provided by the bride's family, was a feature of marriages across many classes, though the scale and form differed. For a noble family, a dowry might consist of land castles or vast sums of money. For a merchant family, it might be cash goods or shares in a trading venture. For a peasant family, it might be livestock tools, household goods, or a small amount of money. Conversely, the groom or his family might make a provision for the bride, sometimes called a dower, intended to support her if she was widowed. These economic exchanges underscored that marriage was fundamentally about pooling resources and securing the financial future of the new couple and their potential offspring within the existing social and economic framework. A modern aside, arranging medieval noble marriages sounds like something out of a reality TV show focused on dynastic real estate deals, but with less dramatic music and more discussions about livestock. And imagine having your financial future tied up in whether your parents can negotiate a good dowry for you. Talk about pressure. A quirky tidbit about medieval marriage customs involves things like hand fasting, a form of trial or temporary marriage practiced in some regions, or the importance of public vows and consummation for a marriage to be considered truly binding. There were also interesting rules around consanguinity being related by blood that could make obtaining church permission to marry complicated and required special dispensations, especially for noble families who had intermarried extensively. The church's role in defining and regulating marriage added another layer of complexity to these already fraught social and economic arrangements. Historians still argue about the agency individuals, particularly women, had within the system of arranged marriages. While the overall structure was dictated by family strategy and economic need, were there opportunities for individuals to influence decisions, delay marriages, or express preferences? This scholarly debate explores the nuances of medieval marriage, trying to understand the lived experience within the constraints of social expectation and family pressure, and the degree to which romantic love, while perhaps not the primary reason for marriage, played a role within these unions. Through carefully arranged marriages, and the strategic management of inheritance. Medieval families across the social spectrum sought to navigate the complexities of their class system, preserving their status, consolidating their gains, or, in rare cases, laying the groundwork for future generations to ascend. These life-defining decisions, often made by parents rather than the individuals themselves, were deeply intertwined with the structure of medieval society, reflecting its values, its constraints, and its aspirations. But this seemingly stable world, built on ancient customs and fixed hierarchies, was not immune to external shocks that could shake its foundations. So you've navigated the layers, seen the rigid structures, understood how families tried to hold on to their place through strategic marriages and inheritance. It might seem like this medieval social pyramid, built on tradition law and stark differences in daily life, was set in stone, immutable for centuries. And to a large extent, the core divisions between noble clergy and peasant persisted throughout the Middle Ages. But medieval society wasn't entirely static. Major crises and long-term shifts acted like earthquakes, sending tremors through the system, creating cracks, and slowly, sometimes painfully changing the landscape of class. One of the most dramatic and devastating of these shocks was the Black Death. Arriving in Europe in the mid-14th century, this plague killed an estimated 30–60% of the population in just a few years. Imagine the sheer scale of death, the sudden emptiness in villages and towns. While it struck all classes, its impact on the labor force was profound. Suddenly, there were far fewer peasants to work the land and far fewer urban laborers for crafts and services. This devastating demographic collapse, the Black Death, is a mainstream historical fact with massive social and economic consequences. For the survivors among the working classes, this created an unprecedented situation. Labor was scarce, and suddenly your ability to plow a field or bake bread was in high demand. Peasants and urban workers found they had leverage they'd never possessed before. They could demand better wages, reduced rents, or fewer labor services. Landlords desperate to get their fields worked, and masters needing hands in their workshops were often forced to make concessions. The old economic model, based on an abundant supply of cheap labor tied to the land, was fundamentally disrupted. The authorities tried to resist this shift. In England, for example, the Statute of Laborers in 1351 attempted to fix wages and prices at pre-plague levels and restrict the movement of laborers, highlighting just how much the ground had shifted beneath their feet. It was like the medieval equivalent of suddenly having way more job offers than applicants, and the old bosses trying to legally force everyone to keep working for peanuts. Didn't go down well. The pressures exacerbated by the Black Death and other factors like increased taxation and ongoing lordly demands also led to outright challenges to the social order in the form of peasant revolts. Throughout the 14th century, there were significant uprisings like the Jacquerie in France and the Peasants' Revolt in England. These weren't just localized skirmishes. They were large-scale rebellions involving thousands of peasants and even some townspeople, targeting nobles, church officials, and royal administrators. They demanded fairer treatment, lower taxes, and sometimes an end to serfdom itself. While brutally suppressed, these revolts sent a clear message to the ruling classes that the old ways were being questioned and that the patience of the working population had limits. The occurrence of significant peasant revolts, challenging aristocratic authority, is a mainstream historical fact, demonstrating the underlying tensions in the class system. Long periods of warfare, such as the Hundred Years' War between England and France, also contributed to social change. These conflicts were expensive, requiring rulers to raise money through taxation, which affected all classes and sometimes sparked resentment. Warfare also evolved. The need for standing armies and paid soldiers increased, reducing the reliance on traditional feudal levies provided by the nobility. This could offer new opportunities for commoners to rise in the military ranks based on skill rather than birth. Wars could also decimate noble families, leading to inheritance disputes, the consolidation of estates or their breaking up, and the rise of new families into the noble ranks. It's hard to maintain a centuries-old family lineage when everyone keeps getting arrows shot at them. Other slower forces were also at work. The continued growth of the money economy, fueled by trade and urbanization, gradually eroded the power of land-based wealth relative to movable capital. This empowered the merchant class further. Challenges to the authority of the church, culminating later in the Reformation, also weakened the position of the clergy as a unified and unquestioned social force. These events didn't overnight dismantle the medieval class system. Kings remained. Kings' nobles largely remained nobles, and peasants still worked the land. But the balance had shifted. The bargaining power of labor increased, contributing to the gradual decline of serfdom in Western Europe. Towns and the merchant class continued to grow in wealth and influence, becoming more important players in politics and society. The rigid boundaries between classes, while still present, became slightly more permeable, and the traditional model of the three orders seemed less and less able to describe the complex reality. Historians still argue about which of these factors, the demographic shock of the plague, the direct challenge of peasant revolts, the economic shifts driven by trade and money, or the changing nature of warfare and state power, was most influential in driving the changes observed in the later Middle Ages. This scholarly debate highlights the complex interplay of forces that gradually transformed medieval society, setting the stage for the early modern world. So while medieval class distinctions were incredibly powerful and shaped almost every aspect of life, they were not eternal. They were challenged by disease, rebellion, war, and economic evolution. The world you experienced earlier in our journey, with its seemingly fixed roles and clear boundaries, began ever so slowly to change, paving the way for new social dynamics in the centuries that followed. And now, as we leave the bustling towns and quiet fields, the imposing castles and echoing cathedrals of the medieval world behind, it's time to let the images soften, the sounds fade. Feel yourself drifting away from the mud, the wool, the incense, the clang of steel, and the distant ring of church bells. The complexities of lords and serfs, merchants and monks are starting to recede, becoming whispers on the edge of hearing. You've journeyed through a world defined by where you stood in society, a world so different from our own. And now it's time to let that history settle gently. Let the knowledge of those layers and lives simply be. Your breathing is slowing, the room is quiet, and the past is drifting softly away, back into the quiet halls of memory. There's nothing more to think about, nothing more to see, just this calm moment as you prepare for rest. Just ease into the stillness. Sweet dreams.